At the end of our last episode, we were travelling northeast, away from Norway, and across the border into Sweden. Norway had been good to us. The landscape was absolutely incredible, and it would be hard to forget such a journey. And the Jeep I'd spent so long building had really paid off, taking us to some beautiful and remote locations off the beaten track, away from popular camping destinations, where it could just be me and Megan, alone, with the wilderness around us. But despite all of this, it was time to leave Norway's mountainous landscape behind, and keep making tracks northeast towards Sweden, where we were potentially looking for somewhere to start a new life together and call our home. But before we crossed the border, we had a couple more stops to make. One was a campsite called Grimsby Tourist Centre. We didn't stay there in camp, but they had a large diner, and we decided to sit down and treat ourselves to some chips, which put a smile on both our faces as we couldn't remember the last time we'd had something like this. They also gave me a free sticker for the vehicle, and then we bought a milkshake and got back on the road and carried on, and stopped off at a small campsite by the side of a river that was popular for fishing, near a small town called Tolga. It was a pretty peaceful area, but sadly it was by a main road, and lorries screamed through the night and kept us pretty alert. The next morning we set off bright and early. After all, at this time of year it was light almost all through the night, so you tended to wake up pretty early anyway. The further east we travelled, the more the landscape started to flatten out, and without even realising it, we'd already crossed the border into Sweden. Sweden was twice the size of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has a population of about 60 million, and Sweden has a population of around 8, most of which reside in the south of the country, meaning the rest of the country is largely dominated by wilderness. Forests, lakes, rivers and old mountains cover the landscape and look virtually endless as you travel through it. It also has a broad range of wildlife, including brown bears, wolves, European elk, or moose as they're referred to over here. Also beavers and a broad range of bird species, to say the least. And the people here tend to live alongside nature rather than on top of it. How's she handling, Meg?
She's very wobbly.
She's wobbly?
Yeah, she's quite wobbly. It's very different to my Ford Fiesta, that's for sure.
Is it?
Yeah. It's like learning to drive all over again.
I like to think of it like you're driving an overweight drunk man.
Yeah, it's pretty much how I describe it, actually.
After a couple of hours of driving, it was time to find a camp location, so we left the main road and set off down a forest road, making our way towards a lake we'd seen on a map. We'd never travelled in Sweden like this before with a vehicle. The last time we came here we were backpackers, so having a vehicle was a new experience for us, and we didn't realise that these forest roads can feel almost endless, as we were driving on this particular road for over half an hour, and the end wasn't in sight. Fortunately, we did find a clearing, which was a perfect camp spot, and also a good place to turn around.
This is the end of the trail.
No, it isn't.
Oh no, it's not.
This was the kind of introduction we were hoping for when we arrived in Sweden. Forest trails, exploration, and remote locations in the wilderness where we could camp. Fortunately, Sweden had similar camping laws to Norway, provided you weren't disturbing livestock or crops, and you were far enough away from somebody's cabin or home. Everywhere we go, there's bones. Camp Bone. We've arrived at Camp Bone. After exploring the area, I decided to look on some newly replaced U-joints on the Jeep, as the old ones had some play in them. But we had both talked ourselves out of camping in this location. We wanted to make progress and continue north to Asele, and there were still enough hours in the day to find another location. So we left Camp Bone behind and carried on down the track, as on the map it showed it rejoining the road, allowing us to pick up where we left off when we joined the forest track earlier in the day. We spent quite a while on the tracks, as they tended to just go on forever, and you'd reach crossroads that took you off in different directions, some of which weren't on the map, but it didn't take us long to get back to the road, and before we knew it we were making tracks as our journey had evolved from what started out as a vacation to a real possibility of finding a new home in this country. So we wanted to make as much progress as possible before camping, so we were close to Asele, where we could reach our friends and see whether actually living here was a real possibility or not. But after driving for most of the day, it was time to find somewhere to rest for the night. Megan spotted somewhere on the map and we decided to check it out. And upon entering the road, we got a glimpse of a moose just running into the woodlands as we drove past.
Wow, it's a moose.
Sick.
Yeah.
We found a clearing where we could park and got settled in, and at 4 months into the trip our vehicle setup was running like clockwork. It had been a long day's driving and we were both very hungry, so we got the kettle on for a cup of tea. Megan cooked up something for us to eat, and then we retired to the roof tent for an early night. It was a very peaceful area, no road noise, no signs of people, just the wind cutting through the trees and blowing across the lakes that surrounded us. Much like many other mornings on this trip, it was an early start, and as we were further north than we were in Norway, it was much lighter through the night, but we were fairly well adapted by now. We made our way back to the road and out of the forest, and spent a bit of time driving on the main roads, before deviating on a forest track once again. We spent a lot of time on forest tracks. There were just so many of them, and with beautiful lakes and scenery in the distance you couldn't help but want to drive down them to try and get there, some of which went nowhere and they were just overgrown and forgotten. But we would often get out the vehicle in this case and scout ahead to see what was at the end of the road, or whether there were any views worth seeing. Other roads that you would discover were service roads that would take you to utilities.
Oh wow, look at that beautiful view.
The pylons of time, beautiful, incredible, standing tall, cutting through the landscape. The pylons of time, they're galvanized, they'll never rust, they're here to stay, destroying your view every day. The Pylons of Time, available on CD.
After recording some timeless classics, alongside some treasure hunting, we were back on the main road again, but it wasn't long before we stopped off at another tourist attraction on our journey, an old mill, hidden away down some back roads, surrounded by stugas, which are log cabins that you can rent and live in for a short period of time. It was still fully intact, but only open at select times, but we investigated the area, amazed by the huge water chutes in the woodlands, and if you looked through the window you could still see all the machinery intact. It's always good to have a reminder of what life used to be like, especially in a country with such a harsh winter. But we also spent a bit of time travelling around the local area to the mill, and found some really interesting camp locations that were accessible via vehicle, or snowmobile or sled dog in the winter. You could see why this country was so popular for fishing, and unlike back home, you could be totally alone in these areas, without the echoes of a Go Ape, Segway centre, or Wall's ice cream stand in the background. After a bit of sightseeing, it was time to check the map. We were getting extremely close to Asele, but it was a bit too late in the day to turn up on people we knew there, so we decided to drive alongside the Elven, which is a large river very popular for fishing that ran through Asele, and find a good location so in the morning we could venture into town bright and early. As per usual with us, paved roads became gravel roads, and the longer we drove, gravel roads quickly became dirt roads, and we managed to find a quiet location besides the Elven. Sadly though, it was next to something called a mura, which is effectively a bog, meaning the volume of flies was almost unbearable. Horseflies, mosquitoes, and knut, or midges that we call them in the UK, were swarming all around us. So we quickly used the area to get some water, and we loaded back into the vehicle and continued on to try and find a better location.
Yeah.
Eventually though, we did find an ideal location right beside the Angermanelven River. The positioning of the vehicle was perfect as it was shielded behind the trees, and the wind cut just past the front of the vehicle, meaning we could set out our dinner table there and the flies wouldn't bother us. We also had access to fresh water and a beautiful view, and it almost felt poetic that we'd gotten this far and found this spot just outside of Asele, where we could prepare ourselves for entering the town tomorrow to see what fate awaited us. MasterChef. It's looking nice.
I'm making mine look, a bit more
You're making yours look pretty.
appetising.
Mine just looks like gromph. Maggie's cutting her hair. It's a hard life. This is a great spot though. This is an ideal location really. The wind's coming in from this angle here, diagonally, and we've parked the truck so all of our cooking stuff is out of the wind. You can see that there, it's not being affected. And we're also not getting loads of wind on the roof tent because of the way we've parked, so the trees partially blocking that. When you step out here though, it gets really, really windy, but the great thing is when it's windy like this, with a bit of a breeze, the flies leave you alone. The mozzies and the midges and the horseflies tend to back off, and there are a few around here if we step into the shady area out of the wind, but if you get sick of them or they start to bother you, something in the woods back there. It's using the trees. Billy! But if you get sick of the flies, you can move away and just eat your dinner in a bit of a breeze like we've been doing. And then you get a break from it all. We woke up to another beautiful day. Sweden was having some unusually hot weather this year, and forest fires were prevalent, so you had to be careful of where you camped. But we were both pretty excited about getting into town and potentially meeting up with people we'd met before on our previous trip to Asele back in 2016. So Megan checked the map and plotted a route from our location into town, where we followed the Angermanelven River, and it wasn't long before we arrived and things started looking familiar. And it was a strange feeling to be back, especially given the way we'd travelled. Asele was a small town, located in a county called Västerbotten, and it consisted of 1,000 people and was relatively remote, but self-sufficient as it produced its own hot water from a solid fuel heating plant. It had a fuel station, a range of mechanics, a hospital, a supermarket, and various other amenities. As small towns like this needed to be self-sufficient. The nearest city was 200 kilometres away, and the next major town 90 kilometres away, and everything in between was wilderness. Given the distance we'd travelled, the vehicle had earned an oil change, so I stopped off at Volk and placed an order for a filter. We also popped into the fuel station to get some supplies, and we bumped into Jocke, a knife maker who we spent time with back in 2016, when we visited Asele before. Jocke had only been making knives for a year when we originally met him, and it was great to see that things had really moved on for him. 2 years on and he'd set up his own company on the side called JO Knives and Design. And not only was he making knives, but he was making a whole range of crafts, out of natural materials like bone, antler, and variations of wood type. Jocke was highly skilled, much like his father, Janne, who we spent time with also. Father like son, he was a knife maker also, and had been making traditional knives since the age of about 12. He was currently in his 70s, and still producing them day to day. And they weren't so much traditional Sami knives, but more like traditional knives with Janne's own twist. He was a truly skilled knife maker, and incredibly meticulous in his work. We were lucky enough to spend the day with them both, and Janne kindly gifted us 2 knives from his collection, which we still have today and still use. It was nice to see a familiar face given we'd just arrived in town, and Jocke kindly invited us back to his place for a cup of tea, although I noticed a car on his drive that he was restoring, a Ford Thunderbird. Fortunately, Megan managed to drag me away from this before the conversation went too far. But after a quick catch-up, we made our way to Huskykennel, Lapland to meet up with Christian and Ingrid. Back in 2016, when we visited Asele before, it was Huskykennel Lapland who had gotten South Destination Lapland to sponsor us to come out here to make a series of videos on the Swedish wilderness for the YouTube channel. Christian and Ingrid were originally from Austria, where they ran an outdoor activity company and did a similar thing with the dogs. But here in South Lapland they mainly specialised in working with the dogs, as guests would come and stay with them, much like we did in the guest house in Asele, where we were provided with equipment and all the things we needed for whatever expeditions we wanted to do. Sadly though, we weren't able to go out with the dogs at that time of year, as it was just the wrong time of year and things were too warm. But we did get to spend time with them on our previous visit and see how they were kept in large kennels in packs with an alpha, which was an unusual way of keeping dogs in this part of the world. But after catching up and seeing the dogs, we inquired whether Christian knew anywhere we could stay in town temporarily or rent, and he pointed out some free cabins on the map where we could stay in the wilderness surrounding Asele. So we said our goodbyes for the time being. Megan plotted a location on the map, and we set off back out into the wilderness, the one place where we knew we could stay, and made our way down a dusty trail into another beautiful location by the side of a dried up water source, alongside the Elven. We were taking some risks coming to this part of the world, with only knowing a handful of people and expecting things to go smoothly. We'd left everything behind in the UK, and everything we owned was in the Jeep. There were so many unknowns ahead of us, more so than we realised at the time. But at least we had each other, and we were mobile, and if things didn't go well, we could always turn around and go home. And say we tried. But Christian had mentioned the campsite in Asele. They had some stugas there that they rent out, so we decided to stay in this location for a night, and then head into town tomorrow and speak to the owners of the campsite and see if there was any opportunities for staying there. The next morning was much like many mornings that had come before it. We were up very early and we began our journey to the campsite in town. And when we arrived, some sort of event was taking place. And much like our luck all the way through this trip, it turns out that one of the biggest events in the whole of Norland takes place in Asele once a year for 4 days. And we'd arrived just a day prior to it starting. The population of Asele was about to become 150,000 plus, visiting over the period of 4 days to see live music, an enormous market of over 1,300 stalls, demonstration of jet skis and snowmobiles on the Elven River, alongside general drinking, fun and enjoyment. Me and Megan visited the market, I ate fish and chips, and also gawked at quad bikes with chainsaws on the front of them. We also made some new friends at the campsite, the son and daughter-in-law of the Dutch owners of Asele Camping, Jeff and Naomi. Jeff was a lorry driver and also an operator of heavy machinery, and Naomi's passion was keeping and racing Siberian Huskies, and one of her dreams of why she moved to South Lapland. We also bumped into Emil, somebody else we met back in 2016. Emil was a hunting guide, and he took us out into the wilderness to hunt capercaillie and ptarmigan, and at the end of the hunt we sat beside a lake, and Emil told us about how he wanted to open a cheese shop selling traditional Sami smoked cheese that him and his wife had been making for many years. And it turns out that dream had become a reality as we walked straight into the shop and saw them both there. And it was really great to see Emil and his wife's dream come true. After making my dream come true and winning a stuffed lol emoji, we went back to the campsite and helped Jeff build a wall around the generator before the campsite got too busy. Jeff's parents, who are the owners of the campsite, had been incredibly kind to us. Whilst the Margnard Festival was on, they couldn't offer us a stuga as it was being rented out, but allowed us to stay on the campsite and use all of the facilities for free. And when the festival was over, we'd be able to rent one of their stugas, whilst we were getting things set up in Asele and looking for somewhere a little bit more permanent. But in the meantime, it was time to leave Asele, whilst the Margnard Festival was still in play. So Megan checked the map and we found a few locations we wanted to visit, and it was time to head back out into the wilderness once again. One location we headed to was Stockholm's Gata, which was a large canyon formation 50 metres deep and about 1.5 kilometres long, and it was formed over 9,000 years ago, potentially due to an earthquake. There were a number of free cabins there where you could camp, and it was a popular location for bear sightings, eagles, or even lynx, if you were lucky. We stayed out in the wilderness for a number of days waiting for the Margnard Festival to end, driving round to various locations and just being a part of nature. We really enjoyed the serenity, something we just couldn't find back home. But after a few days it was time to return to Asele and move into our new stuga. And it didn't take long for us to get settled. It was very comfortable in the stuga, and it was segregated from the rest of the campsite, so we didn't tend to get bothered by anybody. We had our own space outside where we had fires in the evening and sometimes cooked our dinner with friends and socialised. We had a comfortable bed, cosy facilities inside, even a washing machine and dryer. And it was really good to get all our gear squared away, get some work done, and just start to get settled into life here in Sweden. Jumping in the car and going to the nearest town to get supplies wasn't quite as convenient as being back in the UK. Lycksele was 90 kilometres away, so when we worked hard enough we'd treat ourselves to a day out, which we almost certainly made the most of given the distance. And in my spare time, I gave the Jeep a little bit of TLC, rebuilding the draw system so it would work with the 2 rear seats reinstalled. And this way we could have passengers, pick people up from the airport like family and friends. I also checker plated the whole draw system and reinforced it with brackets. This way it could be a permanent installation. I also rewired the electronics and put in a fuse box, so the electronics are actually a part of the vehicle now, and not an extra panel in an unusual place that was hard to reach. I remounted the fire extinguisher so it was easier to grab, put some stainless steel eyes in so we could ratchet strap down baggage and boxes, moved the cage to the back of the vehicle so things could be contained on top of the draw system. I also added some new large spotlights on the front of the vehicle for the dark winters, courtesy of Jeff, who gave me a whole load of LED lights for free. So I put them on the sides and I put them on the back as well, and the rear ones will be rigged up to the reverse lights, as winter was on the horizon, so I had to take my vehicle to Volk and get the tyres studded, so driving on the icy roads would be a lot safer. And I also got a surprise package from Ruff Stuff, as they sent through some control arms and a 1-ton steering kit, which would correct a lot of the geometry problems I'm having with the front axle. I also decided to remove the roof tent and give it a bit of an inspection to see how it held up, and I wasn't happy with the mounting system, so I rebuilt it and made some quick release pins. And if all of this wasn't enough, I managed to pick up a Chrysler 8 1/4 rear axle, 29 spline in 410 gears, along with the gears for the front axle. This was an axle I'd been looking for a very long time, and they're becoming hard to find in Europe. It's an incredibly strong axle, and if some of you have no idea what I'm talking about, it's just a very good thing, and it means bigger tyres. And I was glad I did all this before the weather turned, as the heat wave died away and the rains came in. We lived in the Stuga for about 4 weeks. We even took a trip to Umeå, the nearest city, to pick up some rear seats for the Cherokee, and off the back of that we got invited to an off-road club. They took us out on a special course in the Swedish forest. It was actually pretty technical, given all the trees and tight bends you had to take. Megan even got to try a hand out at spotting for the first time, which I think she found pretty difficult, and understandably so, because it's a very tough job. And off the back of it, she did very well, and we came off the course with no damage, which is always a plus.
Okay, yeah, you're fine.
We'd had a lot of fun, and we'd met some great people. And if it wasn't for the people we'd met and the friends we'd made, we wouldn't be in the position we'd be in now. And it was time to pack up the Stuga and move into our new home, just on the outskirts of Asele. We'd even adopted a dog called Mons, an enormous Great Dane St. Bernard's Cross, who seemed to have taken to us really well and was enjoying his new life. We regularly took him on walks and even runs with us. Mons also came with a cat called Tyson. They were the best of friends. And Tyson was a Norwegian forest cat who spent most of his time outside and most of the day just sleeping in the house. We'd come such a long way, and so much had changed in such a short space of time, but we were both happy and we were enjoying life in Sweden. But there were still many challenges ahead to overcome. But this is where this part of the story ends. To those who have watched the whole series, we hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter very, very soon. Take care.